Accidental Talmudist wisdom you don't wanna miss. Ancient light that shines on today. All his life he'd break the rules, cause he never had the tools, till the Talmud grabbed him that great day, showed him the way. Accidental Talmudist wisdom you don't wanna miss. Now my pal Sal, take it away.
Today on the Accidental Talmudist podcast, our guest is Scott Shay, and we had a far-reaching, deep discussion on how anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism took root in the American universities, where the funding came from, how it's expressed, how the far right and the far left are having a horseshoe effect and coalescing with the exact same messaging. Some of the information that Scott is sharing from his research is dire. It's frightening, but it's good to be clear-headed about the challenge that faces us. And then we also get into what we can do about it. It's important. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation between myself and Scott Shay, the author of Conspiracy U. Welcome to the Accidental Talmudist podcast. I'm Salvador Litvak, the Accidental Talmudist, and I'm very happy to have my friend and in many ways my mentor, Scott Shay, on the podcast today. He's an entrepreneur, an activist, and the author of several books, including Conspiracy U, which we're going to talk about today, a book that is sadly so relevant and so important, as well as In Good Faith, that I look forward to talking about in another day. Welcome, Scott.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sal.
So why don't we're going to get into the conversation about Conspiracy U, but before we actually start that, what inspired you to write a book that addresses anti-Zionism in American universities today?
So this book actually started as an article that I was going to write for one of my father's yortzites for an anniversary of his passing. And I was going to write about a fellow at Northwestern, Arthur Butts, who my father unfortunately was well aware of during his lifetime, who denied that there was a Holocaust. He wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century, all while being a tenured professor at Northwestern University. And
he remained a tenured professor.
He is to this day.
Incredible.
So my father had some very specific opinions about this fellow. And in honor of his yortzeit, I decided to actually write some things that my father had said about Holocaust deniers, but I thought first I had to actually read his book. So I put on some goggles and I jumped into the cesspit, the cesspool actually, and I read this, I think it was almost 500-page screed, The Hoax of the 20th Century. And here's the thing that I didn't realize, is that yes, he's a neo-Nazi. Yes, he hates Jews. But at heart, he claims to be an anti-Zionist. And this is all the problem of the Zionists. And when I recognized that, I started thinking, some of these things sound very reminiscent of what's coming out on the far left. And at about that same time, as I'm writing this article, a to-be professor, a gentleman by the name of, or a professor by the name of Stephen Thrasher, makes a big speech at the PhD convocation at NYU, in which he blasts Jews, blasts Zionism in particular, and talks about how proud he is, and how proud he is of everyone else for their support of anti-Israelism. And he was to become a named professor of social justice at the Medill Journalism School, a school that's supposed to teach even-handedness. And then I started reading what this Professor Thrasher would say. And I'm thinking, gee, some of this sounds like it rhymes. So that set me off on investigating both of their sets of conspiracy theories and other sets of conspiracy theories that were circulating not only Northwestern, but other universities that were unbelievable. And the more I delved in, the more I found that they really had so many similarities. And that's what was missed. Many people talk about anti-Zionism on the right, anti-Zionism on the left, anti-Semitism on the right and left, etc. When you actually dig down a little bit, they're the same. And I'm happy to give you some examples if you'd like me to.
Let's just dive right in. Absolutely. And
So,
and by the way, I want to say at the outset that a lot of people are talking about this subject. What Scott is bringing to the table is extensive research on the subject and data and stats to show this horseshoe effect. You know, that when you get to the far right and the far left, you've got a coalescing of messaging that's extraordinary.
so here's the key. You've got a guy, Arthur Butts, on the far right, and he alleges that this whole Holocaust thing was done because Jews wanted to get certain advantages. So there was this politician, Adolf Hitler, who, yes, he called for death to the Jews, but he didn't really mean that. And Brett says he could have been better. He could have been a little more selective with his words, but of course he didn't mean it. He put Jews to some degree in security zones to protect them against the Russians. And this so-called Holocaust, yes, a few Jews died from a typhus outbreak, but it was nothing more than that. It was trumped up. It was just this epidemic that happened that didn't really impact that many people.
So
And
all of us Jews like you and me who lost many, many family members were liars, according to Butts?
Well, the Zionists were really the liars in this. And, it's not only us who were liars, but he goes into the Nuremberg trials. And he goes into all of the documents, the tens of thousands of documents that were that really report on the final solution and on the minutes of the Wannsee conference. And basically, what he says is these were all forgeries made up with evil intent, and that the testimony of witnesses, victims for sure, like our members of our family, perpetrators, bystanders, were all false because Zionists bamboozle, to use his word, poor, honest, warm-hearted, caring Nazis to confess to crimes against humanity that they would never have actually committed. The Jews sort of hypnotized them. And why did they do that? They did that to gain money, in his view. The so-called Luxembourg Agreement, which was a reparations agreement, he cites a lot, and the monies given to Israel, support for Israel. And this was all done so that Jews could disappropriate some other people from land, take ownership of it, and create their own country to do all sorts of bad stuff. So this hoax was done for a reason. Now, that's on the far right. And actually, it sounds like a lot of what you'll hear from what we hear from the far left, because again, it's cloaked in words of anti-Zionism. And here's the thing I have to tell you, I just have to put this parentheses in, is that I studied the Holocaust deniers. They date back to the 50s in France, the first Holocaust deniers. And at first, people actually were they couldn't even bring themselves to actually deny the Holocaust. I mean, the blood was still on the ground. The ovens in Auschwitz were still warm. So it took a little bit. But then it became a whole industry. The Great Swindle. I mean, I can list you a whole bibliography. It's obviously in the book of books that deny the Holocaust. What amazed me, I mean, I'd like to say outraged, but amazement was really more the term, is that within weeks of 10/7, there was now a new quote unquote Holocaust denial. And it's the same, again, follows the same tropes. At the same time that you have people bragging about how they wanted to kill all the Jews among the Nazis, among the neo-Nazis, you also have people saying that it never happened. And it's quite remarkable to at the same time be live streaming the sadistic murder of Jews. The Nazis never did that. They actually tried to clean up. And at the end of World War II, they tried to empty the evidence and burn the evidence. But in this day and age, both it's live streamed and it's denied. No one ever actually tried to do that before in real time, but it took the neo-Nazis decades to come up with that sort of strategy. And I'm going to get to this other professor at in a moment, Stephen Thresher, who's at Northwestern. But I just have to quote, because at the time it struck me as preposterous. But there's another well-known professor, Stephen Salata. You may have heard of him. Very controversial professor. Was up for tenure at University of Illinois. Wrote a whole bunch of books. By the way, these books are published in prestigious university presses like Duke University Press and the like, peer-reviewed. And he says, this is Steve Salata. He says, the problem with the remembrance of the Nazi Holocaust is that it happens in isolation from relevant historical events and their ongoing consequences. It's not useful if a corresponding genocide is taking place with the Palestinians at the hands of the Jews. And he writes the Nazi Holocaust in Europe. These are his words. I couldn't make them up. The Nazi Holocaust in Europe seems a direct antecedent to Israel's founding. There were plans from the outset of Zionism to rid the promised land of its indigenous population. So like folks today, they're saying this was all concocted for a reason, and any retaliation is justified. That somehow the Jews, and this is another trope from the right and the left, somehow the Jews not only weren't victims of the Holocaust, but they plotted it. And that's exactly what he says. Salita conjures up this multi-generational geopolitical conspiracy. It's a conspiracy theory. And what I show with all of these theories is that they meet the indicia of conspiracy theories in the same way the Denver conspiracy theory, a whole bunch of other conspiracy theories, the Illuminarium. I could go on and on.
How do you define a conspiracy theory?
Okay, so that's a good question. There are two great books on conspiracy theories. One's called Conspiracy Theories, and the other is called Conspiracy Theories: A Guide, that are both written by academics, Javan Joford and Qasim Qassam, both, just academics who were stunned to find, by the way, that not all, but most conspiracy theories tend to have a Jewish component. They're not sure why either. That wasn't their topic. But a conspiracy theory is when you take disparate. So let me say one other thing to introduce a conspiracy theory, is that there's nothing that's sort of perfect proof for anything. There are always things that bother us, that it doesn't seem quite right. Usually they're very tiny, but even in physics, when the Higgs boson particle, there was still a 0.0000002%, 0.2 zero, 2/10 of 1/10 millionth of a chance that it wasn't true. So there's usually something that they find that's some little thing to lever off of. That's frankly, in many cases, meaningless. So Arthur Butts, for example, in his conspiracy theory, levers off of meaningless differences in demographic data. One person counts the number of Jews in Poland one way, another person counts the number of Jews in Poland another way. They're different. One person says the number of American Jews is different, and another person polling comes up with a little number, and they'll go to town. Little small things. But
so discrepancies and uncertainty are the fertile soil.
Very important. But here's the key. You can hate Jews, but the difference between hating Jews and having conspiracy theories about Jews is assuming, or any group, is assuming that there's an evil cabal of people that are off to the side, in this case Jews, conspiring against the rest of humanity and have some sort of super authority, superpower, super ability, so that only you and some group that you're affiliated with can see through this. The average person can't. This flows through Arthur Butts big time. You have to be clear-minded to understand. Most whites and most Germans don't understand this, he would say. Kevin McDonald, a former professor from the University of California, writes that a lot. Again, on the far right. On the far left, you have to get unhypnotized from the Zionist institutions that are, or Zionist-occupied government that's telling you what to believe. This evil cabal of Jews somehow controls everything. And therefore, what happens with a conspiracy theory is any proof you bring against it becomes more proof that it exists. That's a key differentiator of a conspiracy theory from an academic theory. Usually there's not this evil cabal. Now, it's possible to have a theory about a conspiracy, and there have been some. I mean, the CIA did run LSD tests and didn't disclose it, and there was the Tuskegee vaccine conspiracy tragedy. But you take your facts and you try to see if they apply. With conspiracy theories, you don't really do that. Any proof to the negative becomes more proof as to how good those conspirators are at covering it up.
Okay, so I think that's a good working definition. I would probably just add this idea that if you look at history, it's always so complicated. It's always, millions and millions of overlapping stories, creating a web of relationships and many lacunae, where facts just don't exist and people make educated guesses and fill in with stories. That's what history is. And I would say that conspiracy theories is just taking big ropes, ignoring all the, countless filaments that actually join people in movements, and just take a few big clumsy ropes, tie together a few useful facts for the point of view of the conspiracy theorist, and say, there, that shows everything. Point A to point B to point C, cause and effect. I've proven my theory. If you don't believe me, it's because you're willfully blind. And obviously you cannot do that. Reductionist history is not history.
You can't do it. So I could go on and on conspiracy theories, because I actually did a lot of podcasts not regarding Jewish. After I wrote this book, people just booked me to talk about conspiracy theories. But you're 100% right that there are huge oversimplifications. The other thing that's important that everyone who's studied conspiracy theories has found is they're usually created by folks who have a political or ideological motivation. I would say a good chunk of conspiracy theories are started by people who actually know the conspiracy theory is incorrect. For example, Alex Jones probably knew from the beginning that the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory, this is about that the children slaughtered at Sandy
Yeah,
Hook
I've
were
heard of it.
really not there. They were actors. He knew what he was doing. He did it because he was worried that it would be a pro gun control event. That was, to even say that is terrible, but that's the way he would have put it. He was worried that somehow this will raise the backing in the United States for gun control. So he created essentially, and others like him, this conspiracy theory.
Plus, the one who names these theories always makes himself more important, right? Because he needs to be listened to, and the more outrageous the theory, the more attention he'll get, or she.
And Angela Davis is a big conspiracy theorist when it comes to the Jews. So she is one of the key ones.
Now, all of this is understandable in the culture where so many people are competing for the airtime of the culture, as it were. But what's so surprising, or maybe not, but so disappointing, is that these theories are taking root in academia, right? Where there's supposed to be this peer review process, where there's supposed to be this commitment to truth, which would seemingly preclude the germination of these theories, and rather it becomes a hothouse for them. They're not only permitted to grow, they're cultivated and nurtured.
Well, there's no question. Yeah, there's no question that these ideas that are being utilized are actually turning proof on its side, upside down. So, for example, terms like decolonialization. I wrote about this a few years ago. Decolonialization. Yeah. What do these terms mean? What does it mean by any means necessary? Well, these you have to be a professor or somebody with really fancy degrees at a fancy university to think by any means necessary should mean, well, we're going to slaughter all the Jews, and what is so worrisome, because I've read a lot of these folks, is they throw out everything that they should have been trained. So there are definitions. They want to say the Jews are the imperialist colonialists. There are definitions of empire. There are definitions that are well accepted for everybody but the Jews. I mean, for example, Jews have to, not Jews, but there's definitions for indigeneity. So, for example, the French, the English, the Russians, the Chinese, the Arabs are probably all among the most famous imperialists in the world. And you know what's the indicia to tell that almost like that? Language. The more widely spread a language in places far from its origin, the more you can tell it was imposed upon the population. I mean, the reason that English is so widely used is because the English Empire. The reason French is spoken in good parts of Africa is because of the French Empire. Why do they speak Portuguese in Brazil? Empire. There's no other place other than Israel, which was in which the language of Hebrew was recreated and used in indigenous texts from over 2,000 years ago, that would seem to be totally opposite. The whole discussion, and I've read so many professors write these things that are unintelligible about where Jews come from. I mean, they assume that that the Christian scriptures were just made up, and that the Roman historians were liars, anticipating them several thousand years in the future. It's so ridiculous that they have to throw out all proof, any sort of proof that you would say would be obvious, they throw out and they turn on its head or ignore. I mean, it's unbelievable. Some of the stuff that I've read from professors that is peer-reviewed, I mean, Duke University Press has pages and pages, if you want to read it, of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish stuff. You can only find one book on its whole website, which is about some medieval philosophers. Other than that, it's pages and pages. Stanford University published a book by a Northwestern professor, co-authored by a Northwestern professor, in which he worries about moles in the classrooms and how Jews are conspiring, Zionists are conspiring to control the tenure process in anthropology departments across the country, and how she uses the words campus rabbi with quotation marks because they're not really campus rabbis. They're somehow spies. There are moles in class, Jewish moles in classes monitored. And she also reserves a lot of, I don't want to say hate, disrespect for Christian Zionists. By the way, the one thing that's also interesting is the only group that seems to be hated by academics as much as Zionists are Americanists, a term I didn't even know existed. But there's this term Americanism and Americanists that they're coming for next.
I mean, I guess these are both the symptom of the same concept, that all of world history can be reduced to oppressor and oppressed, right? Victimizer and victim. And that is largely explained by white people oppressing brown people. That's the history of America, according to this view. And that's the history of Israel. Never mind the fact that so many Israelis are not white. Never mind that so many of the people who are the so-called oppressed in that situation are white. So the question, look, I mean, you and I could give a long list of why Israel has a right to exist, why Jews, and what is the evidence that Jews have lived in the Holy Land for millennia continuously, and why the modern state of Israel was so necessary to the safety of Jewish people everywhere. But I want to keep us on the subject of Conspiracy U, your book, and ask, how did such a distortion of history and the truth enter the university, become so predominant in the American academy? Is there any cause for hope? I mean, it seems like the trajectory of this movement is getting worse, not better.
There's no question it's getting worse. And there's no question you can now say things about Jews that you couldn't say even 2 years ago when I wrote this book. So first of all, and one of the things I do is I try to figure that out in the book. And I did a lot of research on when this started. And you have to applaud, in a certain kind of way, the enemies of Israel and of the Jews, because this was a process that was really begun in the 70s. The first sort of mindful infiltrations into academia, because and again, the enemies of Israel are, you can't underestimate them. They recognize that if you can get control of the universities and of the faculty in particular, don't worry about the students. That's why even years ago, there wasn't a lot of rabble rousing in the same kind of way. Even 10 years ago, it was a totally different campus. Yes, there were some BDS resolutions, but people who really wanted to control the future of America and American support for Israel recognize the way to do it is the faculty, because the faculty is permanent. Once they're there, they're essentially immovable, and they pick the administration except maybe the president. The provost usually comes from the faculty. And this has been going on slowly. And, like many things, it happens slowly, and then all of a sudden. I've talked to archaeology professors who didn't get tenure just for having a dig in Israel. They didn't even, broadcast being pro-Israel. They just had dug there. I've talked to history department, people at history departments. They, had something that indicated potentially that they weren't against Israel. Maybe they were pro-Israel. That's a tenure. Fatal event.
Right, suicide.
And you couldn't get accepted to many departments now for a PhD program if you betray pro-Israel anything in your social media world. You're just not going to get accepted. So this is going to take a long time to turn around. But there's another thing that's more insidious. And it took me some research at the time. Now it's become public. But I went through the Department of Education records at the time, which weren't made simple. You had to look at them donation by donation. And I found that Qatar, the Qatar royal family, which is a fund administered through something called the Qatar Foundation, had already donated more than $500 million to Northwestern. And by the way, updated those numbers in the last 2 years, they donated another 100+ million. So it's over $600 million. And
just to Northwestern.
Just to Northwestern.
Right.
Only Northwestern. Now, look, we're not going to take up a collection for the Qatar royal family. They are worth $335 billion. According to, I haven't done that research myself. I've taken that from secondary sources.
As we're recording, well, I'm saying as we speak, as we're recording this podcast, the leaders of the Hamas 10/7 massacre are sheltering, probably living in luxury, in Qatar. Right? So
not only are they living in luxury in Qatar, but along with Iran and Turkey, the Qatar Foundation, the Qatar royal family, I don't think the Qatar Foundation does, I think it's direct from the royal family, is one of the largest financial supporters of Hamas to the tune of many tens of millions of dollars a month. Now imagine Northwestern University accepting a donation from the Smith Foundation that also happens to be donating to, I don't know, the Ku Klux Klan or some other organization that believes in the sadist murder of any group. Pick them, any group other than Jews. Don't pick Jews because they're, Jews
would never happen, would be a front page story on the New York Times.
It would never happen. People would resign over. But here, they take the money from Qatar. They somehow hold departments that are pretty well aligned with a pretty negative ideology toward Israel. And not only that, but they advertise a partnership that Northwestern has with Al Jazeera. So now you have and Al Jazeera, of course, is financed by who? The Qatar royal family. Of course. That's public. And they also run a network called Al Arabia. I may not be pronouncing that correctly, but it's, again, public that's the case. So here you have Northwestern taking money from, and let's switch it again to the Smith Foundation. So the Smith Foundation is donating money to the Ku Klux Klan.
And by the way, we're talking about a make-believe foundation. Maybe there is a Smith Foundation somewhere.
Maybe there is somewhere. I made it up. The XYZ Foundation. They're donating money to a Klan, to a group that wants to murder some ethnic group and has as part of their charter, they want total ethnic destruction, genocide,
of a particular
cleansing.
Group. No.
And Northwestern's taking the money. And not only that, but Northwestern has a relationship, a partnership that they proudly advertise with their propaganda arm. How about that? Could that exist anywhere? And so the $600 million doesn't do anything. I mean, give me a break, And
that's just Northwestern's $600 million. Duke is getting $500 million. Harvard is getting $500 million. Yale. There's so many universities. It's funny. Just a few days ago, a friend of mine who's not Jewish, who's a football fan, sends me a little message, and he says, "Can you believe Texas A&M is buying out the contract of their football coach, and it's going to cost them, I don't know, $10 million a year for the next 8 years, even though he's not coaching them anymore." What? How could there be so much money to throw away on the guy who's not even coaching the team? And I just wait a minute. Let me just check. Google very quickly. Qatar, Texas A&M. Qatar has given Texas A&M $1 billion.
So I haven't done any fact checking on the other universities. So I can't speak that, but the numbers to Northwestern I can say are valid. And these universities are so rich. I mean, they made money. Northwestern made between royalties and earnings on royalties like 2 billion ish or more from Lyrica, which was a popular. I think it's generic now, but it was a very popular drug. Um, and they have a $14 billion endowment, which not a Harvard endowment, but it ain't bad. And so, if they're not really that worried about losing the Jewish donors.
Right.
I mean, they'd be a lot more worried about losing that 600 million from Qatar.
Right.
And I've had, so while researching my book, the Qatar contract was up for renewal. And I spoke to some of the trustees off the record. Interestingly, trustees view themselves as being in sort of an honorific position. They're not really, they should be the adults in the room, because if the academics have sold out to their ideologies and to, their Twitter feeds and Twitter fans, or it's X these days, whatever it is, then somebody's supposed to be the adults in the room. And I frankly think we do need some sort of regulation, or some sort of, that regulation should come from the trustees. But if it doesn't, it's going to come somewhere, because here's the thing. If you can't recognize a conspiracy theory, if you teach this upside down theory of imperialism, where you can't tell the difference between an empire and a non-empire, Russia's an empire, China's an empire. You just have to do a little bit of history. Instead, they're the oppressed in China. Or, I mean, it's so basic. Arabia is the cradle of Arabic, but that's because it expanded from there in an imperialist sort of way, which is fine. They're great, one of the great empires, and that's fine. But don't say that they're not. I mean, you're breaking history. And it hasn't only been bad for the Jews. It's been bad for every minority in the Middle East as well. The Kurds, the Azerbaids, the Assyrians, the Yazidis. And I could go on for other ethnic groups, the Druze for sure. I could go on. These are ethnic groups that have been persecuted immensely. And yet it doesn't matter. I consider myself to be pro-Palestinian. I want Palestinian lives to flourish too, which is why it's so, I just don't get why in 1 year, the Bashar Assad murdered more Palestinians than had died from sort of in any of the conflicts in any of the ways from 1948 with Israel. Gassed 600,000 of his people, including, I don't know, maybe 200,000 Palestinians. But
it was in the news cycle of the mainstream. It was in the news cycle of the mainstream media for like a couple days, maybe a couple weeks.
Right. And so
and then
this teaching is hurting people. I mean, it's causing the wipeout of other minorities. And
Scott, what does Qatar get out of it? What is Qatar's motivation for funding this distorted view of Jews, Zionism, and Americanism in the American Academy? What does Qatar get out of it?
Well, it furthers its geopolitical viewpoints, and now it's not about money for them, because if it was about money, they wouldn't be funding Al Jazeera. But they've really, I think, have come up with a generally successful strategy for changing and molding the opinions of the West. I think the only people on their par are probably the Chinese Communist Party, or I don't think even Russia does the job these days that Qatar does. I think Qatar is in the top leagues. Maybe you'd include Russia if you're going to talk about the top three. You'd have to say Qatar, Russia, and China, and we could argue about the order, but it's a very mindful way of putting themselves on the main stage, and you've got to give them credit. It hasn't even created a big dent in their $335 billion.
Right. So, I mean, I think you could say about Russia and China, in some senses, they want more territory. In many senses, they want more geopolitical influence. That's for sure, in order to further their economy. I mean, with Qatar, I don't know how cynical they are in the sense that, are they really just furthering power? Or do they even commit to an ideology, perhaps related to political Islam, that says, their ideology is the best, it should take over, and they'll make use of any useful idiots they can in order to spread their message. I mean, when you see now in these demonstrations about 10/7, gays for Gaza, gays for Hamas, where they ask any Hamas operative how he would handle a gay person, and it would be very similar outcome to a Jew. I mean, they have no tolerance for that. And yet these young people are being persuaded that they're striking a blow for the underdog and for freedom. And I think that they must be laughing at America and laughing at these universities over there at the headquarters, in Qatar. It's
I don't
amazing.
I don't know if you've seen the clip from Eretz Ne'edavet. It's sort of like Israel Saturday Night Live, where they do a spoof on that. And
yeah.
There's no question. I've read, so I follow a lot of these academics who are writing about the freedom fighters in Gaza, and the amazing thing is they haven't read or done any work. I mean, there's nothing about a two-state solution or about Jews surviving a Hamas takeover, and there's no Palestinian state. There is no Palestinian concept in the Hamas charter documents. I mean, essentially, Hamas, as you know, is a part of a political legacy of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a topic for a whole nother podcast, because it's a very interesting political legacy. And excuse me, that conceivably could get to Qatar's motivations, but I can't claim to be an expert on Qatar's, motivations, but I think that may give some hints as to what's going on. And that's why the commonality between Turkey and Qatar, and in this case, Iran from the Shiite side, supporting because it serves their interests. Muslim Brotherhood serves their interests in many ways because it cuts against the bulk of the Sunni leadership in the Arab world. This, again, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm trying to respond to your question and to your critics. There's clearly an environment that's unsafe for Jews, and yet many college professors, not college, but college presidents and deans of students want to give happy, sugary talk about Jews. I've been on a lot of panels, as you can imagine, and I have talked to all sorts of Jews on campus who don't feel at all safe, which is totally rational and appropriate. And the administration, the bad part is the administration just sort of, wants to talk to them like HR, and just talk it to death and, refer them to the DEI group, which really doesn't want to have much to do with them. Because again, it doesn't just fit into the oppressed and oppressor paradigm. But here's what I say, and what I'm a strong believer in is, as bad as it is for students, the focus ought to be on protecting them. or getting them to universities where they'll be protected. What we really need to work on is the faculty, and to getting back to evidence-based scholarship, because ultimately it's not only about the Jews, and it's not just bad about the Jews. It's not just bad for the Jews. It's bad for everything. It's bad for the study of social sciences. It's bad for the humanities. It would be really bad for science if we start to get into ideologically based claims, and it's already leaking in. It's, again, a topic for another conversation, but something like 60% of psychology studies cannot be replicated. There's no validity into most of what you read in psychology. There's a famous study by Professor Ioannidis from Stanford, who retested a whole bunch of science experiments and found a whole bunch of them were invalid. Something like 2/3, I may be I'm approximately there, something like 2/3 of economic studies, the impact is off by 4 times in many. So what you've got is a answer-driven environment in college, where you want to get to a certain answer, you torture the data until it will talk, or you misrepresent it, and so you come out with gobbledygook. I mean, every so often, a famous professor now is getting outed, and they're having to lose their position, whether it be at Harvard, Stanford, all the fancy universities, because nobody checks the data. The data, and I mean, the fact that some of the books that I read by academics that say the most inane things about Jews. There's a book that says the Jews are biohacking the DNA of Palestinians to systemically starve them. That book was published by Duke University Press. It won a book award. It was peer-reviewed. It is ridiculous. That's only one of the many allegations in that book. And you read the book and then you follow the footnotes and you're thinking, who can even make this up? Who can even make this up? Yet it's passing friggin' peer review. So we need to start with the faculty. We need to make sure that you've got people on both sides of arguments, and that may need to be regulated. And I read the Chronicle of Higher Education. I read these articles. I read these opinion pieces. They're so annoyed that people want to actually impose standards on them. But you know what? As they say in Hebrew, Magia lahem. It arrived to them because they so ignored and abhorred standards and are publishing pablum. And I hate to, I used to love Northwestern. I donated to Northwestern every year since I graduated. And now I don't, because they don't care about truth anymore. And they don't really care so much about their Jewish population.
You know what I've heard about that, Scott? Better you should give them $1 than $0.
Yeah.
Right? Because $0, maybe you forgot, but $1, it's because you're sending a message.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is that this kind of material gets published, gets peer approved, allows people to go up the ladder at the universities because it fits the narrative. Doesn't fit the narrative, doesn't go anywhere, no matter how fact-based it is. Fits the narrative, will be published and promoted even in the absence of facts. That is a very, and I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, that doesn't just affect the Jews. I mean, that affects America, that affects the world. And it really makes us tremble for where we'll be in 10 years. I mean, you have 10, 20 years of ignoring the facts in favor of a narrative, promoting people who promote a narrative and don't do actual science, don't do actual scholarly work. Well, then the lunatics are going to be running the asylum. I mean, listen, you run a big business, Scott. Where are you going to hire people, in 10 years? You're not looking at Harvard and Yale and Northwestern. if this is the kind of pablum that they're promoting, where are you going to hire people from?
So I think that's an interesting that's a very interesting and important question. So first of all, in the book, I do make some recommendations for how you can train people to actually learn what evidence is, what facts are, how to build arguments. I mean, I think we really have to start from scratch, and I have a number of suggestions about how to do that. Because again, I don't think this is just about the Jews. And I think if we fight this to be just about the Jews, we surely won't win, because we know we have fewer allies than we thought. We've learned that. We've learned that. But here's the key point. And I also was amazed to find this out. It used to be that when you can measure reasoning skills from people. It used to be that when people left university, their reasoning skills were actually much higher than when they entered. Stunningly, that's no longer really the case. You're trained again to spit back what your professors say ideologically. You might be a little better writer. Hopefully you are. But you're not actually you're not sharpening your reasoning skills, because you're not allowed to. You've got to just agree and become the amen choir. So I actually think that college degrees are becoming less and less necessary. Show the skills that you have. Can you write? Can you code? Can you make a presentation or build a presentation? Can you add value? How are your math skills? And if you learn that online, or you certainly don't need to pay. And when you think about it, the universities have caused such havoc. I mean, they've impoverished a chunk of a generation, caused, and caused debt that the taxpayer is going to pay a good chunk of no matter what. Haven't provided skills, taken time from people, and have taught people to think less well than in the beginning. So what's good about this? What is good about this picture? And why are we supporting them? I mean, the amount of GDP in our lifetimes devoted to higher education has, I think, it's more than tripled. It's between tripled and quadrupled. Mm-hmm. Now, China is producing something like 4 times the number of engineers that we are. They're producing a lot fewer than we are, even though they're a larger population of folks in certain studies areas in the humanities, and like American studies and cross-cultural studies and the like. So we really are in a situation where the universities are putting us at risk as a society and for our future. They're doing it technologically. They're putting us at risk, I wouldn't say ideologically, but just in the ability to reason. I have to tell you one more thing, and then for your next question. But it used to be that people read in this country. Now, one thing that was interesting in talking to professors, even they admit it's very hard to get students to read. I mean, I don't know about you, but maybe I'm a dinosaur, but many classes I had to read a book a week. Now it's check out this. I
still
TikTok.
have those books.
Right.
I love all those books from college.
And you have a relationship with those books, right? Of some sort. You look at them and you don't know exactly what they say anymore, but you have an idea. It clicks.
And I've taken a lot of those books off the shelf. Right. I've taken a lot of those books off the shelf over the years. And coming back to them as an adult with some experience, some life experience, some hard experience, they become even more meaningful. It's funny, you mentioned earlier this phrase, by any means necessary, that's being trotted out as a war cry against Israel, against the Jews, and inciting violence and glorifying the 10/7 massacre. So that's a reference to Malcolm X. And one book that I read in college was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And what was very interesting about that is that this was a guy who evolved more than once. And his thinking evolved over the course of his life. And what is said in his name very often does not match who he was and who he ended up being. I mean, he started as a criminal, he became an activist, he became a Muslim, and he became somebody, who could actually see how you forge, a society that works, and a peaceful society that works. And what is said in his name very often is not what he would say or hold to. Same thing with Martin Luther King, who so famously said, I look forward to a day when people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And that's become completely the opposite of what is going on in American universities now, where it's this victim Olympics. And the only thing that matters about you is the identity groups that you belong to. And as you were speaking, I was reminded, how do we get here? Is it just a sort of a bug in the history of the university that they ended up being so anti-Semitic and, espousing troubling ideologies in many areas? Or is it a feature? Because I just read an article I recommend to everybody by Gary Wexler, who's a professor of marketing at USC. Probably read some of his stuff. And he pointed out that he was brought I think it was in the 80s, by the Ford Foundation, who were very excited. There's going to be a two-state solution. We're going to make it happen. We're going to, market the ideas behind the two-state solution to the world. On the Israeli side, there was almost a giddy excitement about the possibility. The sides were so close. We're going to achieve a lasting peace. There's going to be a two-state solution. And the Ford Foundation was going to just help with funding for effective marketing, to the world about these ideas. And so when Gary and the woman, I can't remember her name, who was working with him on this, were interviewing people on the Palestinian side, they didn't say anything about two-state solution. They didn't say anything about creating peace with Israel. They were just talking about unshackling and independent and liberation for Palestine. And one thing that Gary heard, because he's a marketing guru, and was quite expert even that many years ago, was the consistency of the messaging. That it was like it was being drafted in one place, even though it was being espoused by many different kinds of groups on the Palestinian side. And in fact, all the people he met with said, "Oh, you need to meet with this guy in Haifa. I can't remember the name, the Arabic name." And Gary finally met with him. And he said, first of all, he knew who Gary was. He had researched Gary's background. He knew his family makeup, his parents, where they were from, what he wrote his thesis in. And basically, this guy said, we're going to defeat you. We don't need your money. We're going to raise enormous amounts of money from the Arab world. Probably had the Qatar connection already laid out then. And we're going to have consistent messaging, and we're going to get help in this from the American universities, and that in the name of anti-colonialism and all the language that these professors like, we are going to promote the end of Israel and the end of the Jews across all media, all platforms, undergrad, graduate school, medical school, law school. And Gary said he was just, kind of chilled and intimidated and his skin was crawling, and he thought perhaps he's just talking to a temporarily influential nut job. But no, everything that man said is exactly what they have followed up on, and as you used the word earlier, infiltrated the American Academy with a plan, an effective, highly funded plan, decades long. And we're seeing it playing out.
Well, I actually cite one incident at Northwestern from 1979, which anticipated this. I don't want to go into all the details here, but it's what I was saying earlier. You really have to give the enemies of Israel credit. And the solution here for us as American Jews is not to think we're going to be able to win this with one-liners or short retorts. We're going to have to get into this for the long haul. And again, it's good for America for us to do this, because there's a great commonality behind how societies do in terms of how they treat how Jews can get along. Jews getting thrown out of a country is usually not a good indicator that society is going to do very well, even though I won't have any more Jews left. And I do want to say one thing that I want to get in, that I had anticipated getting in before, because I think it is also an important point to understand the commonality of the right and the left here. And that's one of the big themes of Conspiracy U when you dig into it. I mean, the far right and the far left say the same thing in the same sort of fascist way in many cases. And it's that there's this vision on both the far right. If we can only get rid of the Jews and build a Lebensraum, a living space in Hebrew, not in Hebrew, a living space in German. That was Hitler's goal. We'll have 1,000-year Reich, and everything will be just beautiful. All we have to do is create this Lebensraum and get rid of the Jews. And on the far left these days, or on the pro-Hamas, pro-sadist folks, the view is from the river to the sea. That's essentially the Lebensraum concept, living space, necessary living space for the favored Uber race. And if we only get rid of all of the Jews in that space, then we'll have rid the world of Zionism, of capitalism, of whatever isms is bad in your ism world. And it's a very similar messianic notion on the far left and the far right. And you asked a question earlier that I want to touch into, is that, what's going on in terms of why at the universities, and when did the trajectory change that caused the universities to go in an off ramp? And that is when they moved from becoming intellectual institutions where the goal was scholarship to social justice messianism. And that's when the penny really dropped. I mean, it was a lot of work, as I said again, from the 70s for infiltration, but the mono ideological, you think you used the word feature, but really, because it is a feature, it's not a bug, of what is indoctrinated at universities today happened then.
Yeah.
It's when it moved from we're gonna have people who agree, disagree, and we're gonna duke it out, to you got to get on our social justice messianic bandwagon, or there's no place for you here. We're throwing you off, and whatever happens to you happens to you.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what we got to focus on. And I think in terms of our messaging, we have to figure out why it makes sense to advocate for a society that is where intellectual pursuit is valued, where no one part of the group should be desiring to wipe out the other. And that's its own vision of a really positive future where we do all get along together. I mean, Israel's not perfect. A lot of problems in Israel. We spend a lot of time there. A lot of problems. But you know what? You don't have people killing each other on this. I mean, you do have 20% Arab population. You do have Haredi. You do have secular. You do have religious. You do have a lot of people. It doesn't happen in too many places. There is a lot to be proud of. And somehow we need to articulate that notion. Because if we don't, sort of the secular messianism or the fascist messianism seems to be, very attractive for reasons that befuddle me.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem I think that we run into over and over again is that we argue logic, truth, facts, demonstrable facts, historical facts, archaeological facts. And the other side, doesn't let truth get in the way of their emotional messianism. I don't know. It's very scary times. I mean, you've stated what it is that we need to do, and we need to keep doing it. I think probably this thing that you said that's most true and most important is that it's not an overnight fix. It's not a this year fix. It wasn't a this year or this decade mission for them, right? They've been working hard at this for decades, and we'll need to do the same.
Yep, I wish I could give you some, nice little solution tied up with a little ribbon, and you could probably better than me pick some good uplifting music to go with it. But but it's not going to be that, But on the other hand, we're 3,000 plus year old, we're 3,500-ish year old people, and we're going to have to figure it out. But nobody said it was going to be fun.
Right. Yeah. Now we'll survive because we always have. And as you pointed out, many times Jews have been called the canary in the coal mine. Right? So as a nation treats its Jews, so it will go for that nation. And all the enemies of the Jews have disappeared from this world. And I think that will happen again. I don't consider it Jewish messianism, although I look forward to the coming of Mashiach. But we also see that as much as the Bible, is a religious text and does much more than tell history. Nonetheless, all the claims of the Bible have been borne out over and over again. I know that you cite Jeremiah several times in Conspiracy U. Jeremiah, it was not easy for him. He saw what was coming. Part of my messaging at Accidental Talmudist, and I'm a very proud Jew and a very proud Orthodox Jew, is that the deed of title to the land of Israel, as it were, is the Torah. That's where the relationship began. And when you say that, the other side will say, "Well, you invaded the land 3,000 years ago, even according to your text." And I think that's an interesting argument that they can make. It wasn't the people who are living there now who were sacrificing their children and who were wiped out in those wars of conquest back then. But it is true that there was a contract, right? That God made with us, said that, okay, the Jews can set up a society here. And then like any historical nation, there were wars fought at its inception. And then, the Jews had sovereignty over Israel for 1,000 years. That pretty much qualifies as becoming an indigenous people for any other nation on earth. But if we're going to look at the Bible said that the Jews have to live according to the precepts of Torah. And that's always going to strengthen our claim and our safety and bring peace sooner, So I think it is important that as we talk about academia and as we talk about politics and all these other subjects, that we should also remember that it is our responsibility, to live by and share the values of Torah with the world. And I see that operating very strongly in your book, even though you're talking about very secular subjects. But you're talking about a people that is defined not only by history, but by its Torah. And it's important to bring the Torah values into the conversation as well.
Well, I think you can certainly, and one thing that I talk about a little bit in the book is the argument for Israel and for the state of Israel. I mean, in terms of, it's one of the few nations on earth that actually was voted into existence by the UN, which there's a very strong legal argument, and for Israel, there's a very strong legal argument. I mean, for indigeneity, the Jews tick every. I mean, it's one of the only two Bronze Age entities that's still around, and as a reclaimed the space. By the way, the other Bronze Age entity that reclaimed the space and didn't have one in the 20th century also suffered a genocide, the Armenians. There's a danger to not having your own space. And, again, all the other Middle Eastern minorities have seen that. The Maronites, the Assyrians, I think I mentioned them before, the Kurds. It's very dangerous not to have your own space as well. And also, look, the Arabs have a historic claim to lands in the Middle East. But on the other end, they came, sort of in the year 8, maybe 1,200 years ago, as opposed to 3,000 plus years ago. So in terms of indigeneity, the Jews shouldn't be the only group where indigeneity has a use by date. I mean, indigeneity is indigeneity.
I mean, what's funny about that visual aid, of course, and that visual aid that the anti-Zionists will always trot out is the map of Israel, showing how the state of Israel encroaches on the Palestinian state over the last 70 years. And that map is so misleading and so obviously misleading when you simply zoom out the camera. And then you find that there's, people count in different ways, but there's at least 20 Arab nations that occupy space so large it encompasses curvature of the earth. I think it's larger than the United States, all the Arab countries together. I think it's quite a bit larger than the United States. And so Israel is this little sliver that when you're looking on a globe, it's very hard to find in all of that landmass. And so what you're saying is there's no room in the traditional homeland of the Jewish people for Jews to have a state because this other people, there's no room for them anywhere in this vast space where people speak Arabic and practice the same religion. There's no room.
So I'm gonna say something that also requires a lot of unpacking, but I'm gonna just give the headline and then people can see if they want to figure it out. Mary Douglas, famous professor, wrote mostly about non-Jewish topics, but she did write a famous book about Leviticus. And one thing she notes, she's an expert on taboo and on token and taboo. And she says that a thing out of place is what is in a certain kind of way taboo. It's like dirt on a carpet. So what you've described to someone who has a certain sort of messianic ideological view is there's this whole area that looks the same. But you know what? There's this one speck of dirt and it needs to be cleaned or it needs to somehow be made taboo. So it actually isn't, it's a sort of the exact opposite of the way you're characterizing it from a taboo, clannish sort of way. It's how much the more so that needs to be cleaned up. Now, the Abraham Accords were going in the opposite direction. They were saying you're actually part of that mosaic. I'm using that word maybe in tongue in cheek, but you're part of that. You're part of us. And that was going, I thought, in a very interesting and productive way. And you know what? I think, part of the reason this whole situation started is because Iran saw that it was going in a very productive way. And
just so.
Yeah,
Just so.
and so they didn't like that to be. But
And I think that conversation will resume after this crisis. I am very, I pray that it will continue and that it will lead to a flourishing community that includes the Jews, per the Quran, who refers to the Jews as the children of Israel. So, listen, I think that we need to be, I think we need to find positive messaging where it exists. I think that we have to be realistic about what possibilities are and what is the work before us. But I really want to thank you, Scott, for coming on the Accidental Talmudist podcast today, discussing your book, Conspiracy U, available on Amazon.
available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, anywhere where quality books are sold.
Anywhere where quality books are sold. It's a really important read, not only for laying out how we got here and how it's operating, but I think that Scott's real world recommendations for getting, professors in the academy refocused on truth and a truthful process for arriving at information and